Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and welcome to the first video of 2021. With the days counting down to the kickoff of Champions Tour, I wanted to take a look at the map-by-map stylistic metas that have started developing all around the world. To get to anything really meaningful or applicable with them though, we have to look at it from a couple different angles first, so let's jump right in. One of the key things that we'll be honing in on in this video is how map specialized certain regions are and how prevalently they play it relatively to the international ecosystem. The natural starting block for something like that is obviously going to be the map pick rates for each region. We see here the outlay of all of the map pick rates across the major regions as defined by the upcoming Champions Tour, and these are all drawn using data from the First Strike era of play, patches 1.12 through 1.14. As is pretty plain to see, Icebox hadn't picked up any meaningful meta share by this point, and in all reality, it wasn't even available uniformly across these regions during this time frame, so we'll be excluding it from the data for our purposes. While these granular statistics are great for region-by-region analysis, where we're here looking at more of a comparative relative analysis, we want to break this down into a more layman's term form. For that, we're going to grade each of the regions inside of their vertical, looking at the prevalence of each map within a given region. Shifting to that form of display, you see that there's a fair bit of variety. And while it's definitely there, fair is most certainly the most accurate word to use because there is commonality across a couple of the regions. We have both North America and China having a Haven, Ascent, Bind, Split hierarchy. We have Southeast Asia and the EU, Middle East, Africa region sharing a 1, 2, 3, 4 hierarchy. And Brazil and Latin America standing alone with an Ascent, Haven, Bind, Split hierarchy. Obviously, there are some immediate takeaways here, the uniform categorization of Split as the least played map in any given region, and the pretty uniform prioritization of Ascent and Haven across more or less the entire world. These are states of being, though, that are fairly well known and kind of common sense at this point. To look at this through a lens that's a little bit more exciting, instead of encapsulating each region in its own vertical, we're now going to look at things laterally by map across all of the different regions, seeing where maps are prioritized the most. This is hardly a perfect analogy, but what these numbers are generally going to indicate is the level of specialization a region has in a map relative to the rest of the world. We're functionally saying that in these regions, the given maps represent the smallest relative segment of that region's map pool. Adding in the other layers just for visualization's sake, and we see how the entire hierarchies pan out across all of these regions. There are a couple interesting observations to be had here. For instance, we have North America, who's the most specialized on Haven, the second most specialized on both Bind and Ascent, but dead last in Split, showing their very clear preference for an almost 3 map pool. And we see that Brazil, coming in with nothing in a top 2 slot, is a seeming jack of all trades, master of none, where the breadth of their pool is very spread. On that topic, if we actually go back to the original statistics and look at the variance for each individual region's map pool, we can look at it in terms of how well divided their pool is. The result for that is China in first, EMEA in second, Southeast Asia in third, Brazil and LATAM in fourth, and North America coming in dead last. You might look at this and say, well, if Brazil was a jack of all trades, why is it that they still end up fourth on this list? And it ultimately boils down to a fact that they have a very North American style in the way that they prioritize the top 3 maps on the list, Ascent, Bind, and Haven, but proportionally, they neglect Split more than the other 3 regions who are above them. If we look at EMEA, China, and Southeast Asia, they all play Split at a roughly 19% rate, whereas Brazil plays it at only a 17% rate. That still beats out North America's 12%, but relative to the 3 who rose above them, they still fall short. This creates an awkward instance where the regions around them are both more specialized in those top 3 maps, but also Brazil doesn't lead the pack in Split either. Coincidentally, it is the prioritization of Split, specifically, that lands China in this top slot. Now to get to the real meat and potatoes of the video though, we want to take a look at what map each region plays the most relative to the other regions, their functional specialized map, and see how their style performs on that map. These regional map specializations hash out as follows, with NA taking the top slot for Haven, EMEA taking the top slot for Bind, China with Split, and SEA with Ascent. Unfortunately, Brazil and LATAM not picking up a specialization at the top of the totem pole for any one map. To dive into the stylistic indicators for these maps, what we have here is a result mix. This kind of analysis is only made possible by the fact that I recently got my hands on Run It Back GG's API bot, which has given me access to a lot of these broader inter-regional statistics that frankly would have taken hundreds of hours to manually collect myself. To more clearly explain the graph in front of you, we have a top performing team from the majority of the first strike regions. You then have stacked bars that represent 100% all potential outcomes that happened in their games, each colored and indicated to a specific outcome that represented the result mix in those games. If we look at the top on the list, 100 Thieves, and use it as an example, it breaks out like this. If we look at all of the rounds that 100 Thieves played, 22.7% of them were rounds that they won on the attack side of the map via killing the opposing team. Just under 7% were attack rounds that they won via having the spike explode. 12.5% were defensive rounds that they won by killing their opponents. Just over 10% were rounds that they won on defense via defusing. 18.5% were attack rounds that they lost via being killed. 6.5% were rounds that they lost on attack by having the spike defused. 3.5% were rounds that they lost on attack via being timed out. Just under 17% were rounds that they lost on defense by being killed. And just over 2% were rounds that they lost on defense via the spike going off. A little bit abstract to understand at first, but once you get your grips on it, it's a very strong indicator of the overall success and how teams are approaching a given map. This allows us to dive quite a bit deeper in that a lot of the time we know whether or not a map is attack-sided or defensive-sided, but how do teams stylistically approach that natural map balance? Is a team leading the world in the way that they approach a map because they counter a map's defensive bias by increasing their potency on attack? Or do they find their success by leaning into that defensive bias? These sort of charts, when broken out, allow for a very clear and very visible portrayal of that nature. So starting here with Ascent, the teams that we want to look at are the ones from Southeast Asia. For those purposes, we're going to take a look at Absolute Jupiter and Vision Strikers. If we break out those bars to segment attack, defense, and loss, it gives us a little bit more clarity in terms of exactly what we're looking at and how they stack up against their regional counterparts. Further, if we layer an average on top of the existing bars for both attack and defense, you can see very clearly where these regions stand above the rest of the pack. In this specific instance, we see that they're both almost dead on the average when it comes to their attacking sides. They don't perform noticeably better than anyone else, however, if we look at their defenses, they're both very clearly above the average. The strategic takeaway for this is that in the region where Ascent represents the largest proportional segment of the map meta, where it's functionally played more than anywhere else in the world, the way that the team at the top of the food chain established their dominance wasn't by trying to shore up the naturally disadvantaged attack side of Ascent, but rather leaning harder into the defensive bias and exerting more power in that way. If I had time in this video, I would certainly do this, and if this is something you're interested in a future video, please let me know down in the comments, but we would be able to go back and look over Absolute Jupiter and Vision Striker VODs and pour over exactly what it is that they do on their defensive side that might lend itself to creating this distinction. Moving on to Bind, we're going to use the same chart and general style of analysis to get to our conclusion. This time, the team that we'll be taking a look at in particular is Heretics from EU. First, we carve out the attack, defense, and loss verticals as we did before, and then slap on the averages. We very quickly see something that's incredibly interesting to me personally, in that the way Heretics has risen to what is relatively the most bind-specialized region in the world is the opposite way that the Southeast Asian teams rose to the top on Ascent. They are leaning into the attack side of bind, the statistically weaker half of the map, and excelling in it. Moving on to Haven, we get to a little bit of a weirdo because, given the numbers we've looked at thus far, the team that we should be looking at is 100 Thieves from North America. However, when we start looking at their numbers, there is something horribly, horribly wrong. They don't even eke out a 50% win rate on the map. This doesn't necessarily disprove our hypothesis up to this point. In fact, in my opinion, it shows us something different that in itself is incredibly interesting. If you look at other North American teams and their specializations, teams like TSM and Sentinels, they're absolute juggernauts on Haven as a map. So I believe very firmly that the Haven specialization in North America is still a sound point to make. But what this is showing us is that 100 Thieves has found their success in North America not by leaning into the map that's specialized in their region, but by actively avoiding it. That's a story for another video though, and where we're intentionally trying to look at map specializations here, we'll look instead at the second down on this list, which will move us over to Edward Gaming and China. If we move over to the breakout, we see that EDG is a little bit of an oddball compared to the other two maps that we've looked at thus far, because they're almost smack on the averages on both sides of the map. That is, of course, right up until you realize that there is one massive statistical outlier here that is warping the lot of them. I don't know what Gamelanders eats for breakfast, but evidently it makes them nigh unbeatable on Haven defense. If you remove them from the pool though and readjust the average, I think it gives us a far stronger indicator in terms of the stylistic approach that Edward Gaming brings to the map. On Haven, a map that traditionally has a mild attacker side bias, EDG, much like Heretics on Bind, leans into the opposite half of the map, shoring up the weaknesses of the disadvantaged side in order to find an advantage overall. And that will bring us finally to the last map we'll be covering, Split, the one where Edward Gaming was actually supposed to be the one at the top. If we go to the breakout, we see that, funnily enough, it's another Gamelanders situation, but this time with Heretics. When we look at the attacker side, it's a fairly steady pool and the average makes complete sense, but when we look at the defense, things change quite a bit. Heretics is such an outlier that it leaves Edward Gaming, who's otherwise the fourth most defensively successful team in the world, below the average. If similarly to what we did in the last map, we remove that outlier, it shows that Edward Gaming ticks just slightly above that average. Having made that change, the conclusion that we can draw from the style that EDG exhibits is that leaning into the attack side, again the weaker side of the map, is what defines their ability to succeed on it. However, it's worth noting that on this map, and with this style in particular, it is the most balanced of any example on this list. In every other instance, there was a push and pull. If a team was specialized on the attack side, their defensive side dipped slightly below the norm, and vice versa. In this case, we have a team that was above average in both elements, the attack side being the specialization only in a matter of relativity. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut it off there, but hopefully you all enjoyed this little dive into map specialization. Definitely a bit of a weird abstract concept to get at first, but to give you one last hyperbolic example that hopefully drives home what we're looking at, imagine I play in a region where Haven represents 50% of our map mix. You have to assume that the way that I play Haven, my set plays, the creativity I bring to the way that I approach rounds, the nuances in the way that I tackle the map are going to have to be a little bit more advanced than other regions by comparison, just by virtue of the fact that my region plays it so much that these things get stale faster. The creative engine needs to spin quicker in order to keep pace with those around me, just due to the number of iterations we're going through. We're taking that assumption that if a region plays a map relatively more than everybody else, they will be, even if just incrementally, slightly closer to a solved, highly effective version of tackling that map. Just want to take a quick moment, to thank the guys at RunItBackGG. Without their recently released API bot, the mix part of this video would not have been possible. I don't know if you all have seen the heat maps and crazy statistics that a bunch of coaches have been putting out on Twitter using their bot, but it is a fantastic tool and a massive boon to someone like myself to have even indirect access to the API at this point in time. So huge thank you to the guys at RunItBackGG. Per the usual, if you're enjoying my content, please like and subscribe. You can also catch me on Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram, all at AnderzzTV. And as usual, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.